you so much, Tim. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be chatting all things energy transition for the next 45 minutes. If we can welcome the panel to the stage. Amazing. So we're going to dive straight into the context around the energy transition now. So what are the big drivers shaping the global energy transition? If you want to get us started.
Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. As I say, Emma Guthrie from the Hydrogen Energy Association. So I guess a lot of my comments are probably going to be related to how hydrogen acts as something of a glue, I guess, within this clean energy space, sitting around the big decarbonisation and electrification efforts. I think there's clearly been significant and impressive developments in the growth of renewable electricity that supports the transition towards net zero. And I think what we see is that as we move forward, some of the challenges now exist around the hard to electrify sectors. So some of the, let's say, somewhat easier jobs are happening or have been happening. And where I see, from my perspective as someone in the hydrogen space, is hydrogen has a number of roles that it can play to sit alongside this transition from coal and gas towards electrification by either buffering out intermittencies or acting as a zero emission transport fuel in areas, again, where batteries may not be playing as easy a role as perhaps they can in some other sectors. So for me, I think there's exciting things happening within the transition, and representing the views of the hydrogen sector, it's looking to see where we can add value into some of the great work that's already happening.
Rhian?
Yeah, so I'm Rhian Kelly, the Chief Sustainability Officer at National Grid. I guess everyone's heard of National Grid, but not everybody always knows what we do. But we are electricity networks in the UK, so we do all the pylons in England and Wales, and then actually we distribute into, just before it gets to your home or business, in East and West Midlands, the south of Wales, and down into the southwest. And one of the biggest things we're seeing on our networks at the moment is rise in demand across both the sort of transmission bit and the distribution bit of our business. So in our distribution business just last year, we saw 42% increase in demand for connections into our networks, and then 28% on generation. So these are things that I guess sort of a while back we weren't necessarily expecting. And so over the next sort of decade, out to about 2035, we expect there to be between 5 and 9 million more electric vehicles and between 1 and 3 million more heat pumps. That's just distribution alone. And then in transmission, the biggest thing we see is the increase in demand from data centers. So we're at the point where we're a regulated business, so we have to submit business plans to our regulator Ofgem. We've just done that, and in that plan, we've increased our investment to 35 billion, which would be from April 26 to March 31. And that includes projects that we probably hadn't imagined 5 years ago, so 17 huge infrastructure projects, but also we plan on renovating sort of 3,500 kilometres of overhead lines. And a lot of this is then driven by that increased demand, particularly from data centres. So that's one of the big things we see at the moment in our networks.
Dirk, what about you?
Yeah, perfect. So my name is Dirk Itzstein. I'm representing NLEX Advisory Services. We are basically an energy and decarbonization advisor for international corporates. And what we basically do is help clients understand consumption of energy, cost, risks, and the link to emission. And we do that basically also to inform the strategic energy planning that they do, and also the link to climate transition planning, basically. So very, very pragmatically. So I'm here also to share a little bit the voice of the corporates and the commercial industrial community. And what we see is, obviously, there has been a lot of interest over the past, basically, decade on renewable energy, to integrate that into energy planning. Obviously also driven by regulation. Yesterday there was a long debate already about the changes here in Europe and how does it affect, and also the impacts of recession. That's at the moment what we see. I mean, the question is how much self-motivation does the commercial industrial community have to proceed. And I have a lot of examples on both sides, so maybe for later then.
Perfect. John?
Hi there, my name's John Bamford. I'm from Schneider Electric's sustainability business, and like Dirk, support clients and corporates in their climate transition. Regarding the drivers, I think one of the key elements is independence and security of energy supplies. Obviously, in recent years, we've seen the advent of the pandemic driving automation, driving home working, and increased infrastructure or requirements and demand on the ICT. Matt Manning mentioned that earlier today. And we also have recently seen in geopolitical crises that the increase in gas prices have gone up dramatically. And that obviously impacts on the consumers, both regionally and at a corporate level. And I think that it's very important to have security of that. So transitioning towards a low carbon, self-serve environment where we've got renewable energy or electricity driven through hydrogen or lower carbon fuels is absolutely essential. Over the last 20 or so years, we've seen gas prices volatility move around up and down about 4,000% through the research undertaken across the EU. And that's a dramatic increase. And obviously, the regional governments are trying to put in energy caps associated with that, but that doesn't necessarily drive the change that we need to see around the transition. Obviously, return on investment in the infrastructure within the generation of renewables is going to be an important part. And obviously, if we're not seeing that cap, that return on investment is actually a lot quicker.
Michelle, lots of nodding there.
Yes, there's a lot to unpack. So I'm Michelle Davis. I'm EY Sustainability. I'm a lawyer, and I've been in sustainability and climate change as a lawyer for 25 years. And so I've been through all the ups and downs that our sector has faced. But you asked a question, what is driving the energy transition? And I think my answer today is different to what it might even have been a couple of months ago, if I'm honest. So my colleagues here have all talked about demand, and that's hugely important. We are moving into a different world environment with the growth of tech and data centers, and that is going to, that's going to have a significant impact to the extent that some governments are questioning whether they should be promoting AI as much because they don't have the energy to supply it. I'm a Welsh girl, so I'm chair of Net Zero Industry Wales, and that's something that's being debated in Wales at the moment. But what is driving net zero? If I look back to, 20, 15 years ago, it was predominantly environmental concerns, and the world was awash with subsidies, and there was a program that seemed to be adopted in most countries that these subsidies followed. And then I think when COVID happened, there was a lot of messaging, I don't know if you remember it, around, well, if you think this is a catastrophe, if you think COVID is a disaster, just wait and see what climate change brings. And I think what happened, well, I don't think I know, because I was acting for a lot of participants at the time, a lot of capital went into sustainability. We saw private equity come into net zero suppliers. We saw new infrastructure funds being raised, other funds being raised, and a lot of capital coming in. If the fund was an Article 8 or Article 9 fund, woohoo, let's put our money into this. And it was almost a little bit like the emperor's new clothes. And then a number of these funds didn't really deliver on what the investors expected. Because sustainability isn't easy, clean energy, net zero isn't easy, but there are plenty of people who I've worked with for 25 years who've made a significant amount of money out of the sector. So it is investable, it is viable. But I think with that, there was a sort of a movement back. And then, of course, we've had significant political changes in the world with President Trump getting into power. And a number of people that I've known in the sector for many years have been really driving the energy security reason for net zero. Not just the need to secure our own energy, but also to be energy efficient so we become less and less reliant on those countries that are controlling rare earth materials. And this is where we are today. We can see it. It's a live issue. So going to what you said about being susceptible to gas prices, that is a situation I think now that many countries cannot be in. And they've realized once again, it came about during COVID and then the world forgot. But now we see very clearly we have to do, I think, two things, and these are the big drivers. We have to achieve energy security and we have to achieve commodity security. We don't have the commodities and a number of countries don't. Therefore, we have to really drive energy efficiency. The big challenge in all of this, in my view, is the balancing solution and what governments are prepared to do to enable the balancing solutions to be economically viable.
Amazing.
That's mine.
You're a step ahead of me as usual, Michelle, because I did want to go on to the challenges. So, Rian, if you can get us started, what are the biggest barriers to embracing and transitioning energy?
So I was going to start sort of internationally. In the UK, I think we have done a good job of bringing more renewables into our grid and keeping the lights on, quite simply. That isn't the true for every country in the world. And so one of the things that we spend quite a bit of time is talking to other governments in the global south about what we've done here and what they could learn. And it also, can they leapfrog some of our learning? So I think there's just a piece around one of the barriers for other countries is being able to do what we've done, and how can we support them. For us, I guess, it's a barrier and it's an opportunity, but I mean, we're a regulated business, so the way regulation shapes us, the way it recognizes risk reward, the way it allows us to invest and to get some return on the investment, weighing all that up is really important for our ability then to put in place our massive investment plans, as I talked about. I think the other thing I'd pull out is innovation. I suspect we'll come to it later, but we don't have all the answers today for how we decarbonise. I think we need to be looking at new technologies. And so one of the things we've done is create a $500 million venture capital fund to look at and work with interesting technologies that we can bring into our industry, into our business, deploy at scale, and then ideally spin off into other energy utilities. So those are three. I suspect everyone's going to say more, and I'll be nodding along to what everybody else has got to say.
I mean, I think when you look at barriers, the cost of doing something for the first time is key, isn't it? And then what you see now when I guess there's so much pressure on spending, I think there's a dilemma for governments and for industry in general in who goes first. And I think the mindset is either you go first, you make the investment, and then you become a first mover. And I think the argument coming from the UK is potentially if we can do that within what seems to be quite a favourable policy landscape, it then gives the impetus for future growth for UK PLC. I think the counter to that, and you hear some of these arguments, is that if the policy landscape, and I speak here from a UK perspective, makes it difficult and expensive to do things, then companies may go into places where it's cheaper. So I think that's the dilemma, and I'm clearly a favour of the first option. So I think as a sector, having a healthy dialogue with government and working in what I see at this moment in time feels like a favourable policy landscape to enable UK to be a first mover in many parts of this clean energy sector, and hydrogen is one of them, will give us value in the longer term as UK PLC to be a pioneer and to be able to export and then encourage others. So I think the policy area could be a barrier, but I think we should use it as an opportunity and a means to support investment rather than saying the costs are too high, so we should maybe pause. That's the balance I see.
I like that, turning challenges into opportunities. Dirk?
Yeah, so basically, I think we have to differentiate, I think, a little bit from developing nations and to developed nations. So developing nations is obvious, it's a financial risk associated with it. We stay with the developed nations then, and representing again the commercial industrial world. Also business case is a topic. Developing the right business cases. Yesterday there was a lot of discussion about that already. But what we also see is, sometimes some companies of ours, clients of ours, they obviously see all the challenges around on regulatory uncertainty, the recession, all of these things as irritation, and they don't really they don't really know how to adapt their own strategic energy plan and climate transition plans. But others are really seeing that as noise, right? It happens, but the underlying fundamentals are not changed. And personally, I also think that if we have this summer another heat wave, I think the discussion will become much more different again, because it is quite daily topical, often the discussion. So, so challenges then, if you look at these companies who really are pursuing their strategy, these companies still face the challenge of, again, internal communication and stakeholder alignment, and also then engagement with their supply chains and their customers. And this is something that sounds super basic, I think, as a challenge, but it is super real and is, for many of you also in the audience, I mean, you are facing this day to day where it is maybe parts of a company is aligned and another part is not, and there's a long journey to get the alignment, and we will talk more about this probably later on. But if you think about even companies who have clear plans to pursue renewable energy strategies, the amount of discussion and alignment to really act on it and implement is massive. And I think whatever we can do together as a community of professionals to help the pace setters, and then basically in that sense also help the supply chains associated, I think this is really the endeavor that we all have.
John?
I'd second exactly what Dirk was saying, specifically at a corporate level. Clearly, governance is required to make a transition within the businesses themselves, to understand what they need to do in order to operate, have a license to operate in a low carbon economy, but also where they look to reduce their emissions, say through an energy transition, through corporate and aggregated PPAs and the like, to invest in renewables if the infrastructure is not there to essentially provide sort of hydrogen in the first instance. So I think governance is really critical. I think it is a challenge in some companies. I think the siloed mentality still exists in certain areas. And I think also in the corporate world as well, there is a general view at C-suite level that it is a 5-year sort of cyclical presentation of strategy that then needs to look at a much longer term. When we're talking about PPAs, you're talking about 10 to 15 years. And I think that understanding of the longer term impact needs to be taken into strategic decisions and the governance embodied within corporates or developing into corporates. And I think there is regulation out there, TCFD or CFD in the UK, and also the TPT requirements that really does look at the governance model to support transition. So I think we're getting to the point where there are solutions at the forefront, but with the clients that we work with, it is a leap into faith, a leap of faith, I should say, that is essentially something that is a long-term journey as well.
And it all comes down, all these challenges ultimately all come down to cost. Yeah. And I think, given what's happened in the last couple of months, we've all got to slightly pivot, and we've got to be realistic about where sustainability is. All sustainability activities now, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to think about this, I think are going to have to be able to track through to value. The days of being able to say, I'm doing this because it's a good thing to do, might be over because key stakeholders rightly need to understand, well, how is that going to create value? So I think the narrative is going to have to be much clearer around that. Now, I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit controversial that links this, and it links your point about developing nations as well, because developing nations can't afford to get to net zero. Corporates and other bodies in the developed world are struggling with the cost of getting to net zero. If we could create an environment where carbon credits could be properly and empirically authenticated and justified and commoditized and capable of being trading, and people accepted them as part of the transitional journey, so we don't buy credits as a license to pollute. We buy credits because the cost of us completely transitioning our business is simply not economically viable right now. But we have this plan, and I totally agree with you. Our clients are looking at 5 to 10 year plans. We have this plan, and under CSDDD, CSRD, and TPT, if you want to know what all those acronyms are, Jess, my colleague, is sat in the front, she'll tell you. But under all of these, transition plans are now necessary because, rightly, key stakeholders, particularly financial institutions, need to have visibility on where an organisation is on its net zero transition. Because at some point, all of this is going to kick in. And if you haven't got on the journey, you are at risk of becoming a stranded asset, and the financial community knows that. But if you had a transition plan where carbon offsets were a sensible and justified part of that, they were not the only answer, they were part of an enabling solution to enable you to get to net zero, I think that would be accepted. And I do think carbon credits could play a critical role in enabling corporates in developed countries to transition in an economically viable and secure way, and enabling developing countries to get the finance they need to stop using coal and oil. That's my view again.
Wow. That's a whole plan. That's incredible.
Are we with solutions already then?
I mean, as usual, Michelle's ahead of me. I was going to chat solutions, but I think Michelle already has one. That's a very broad sort of plan. I was going to chat tech solutions specifically, if that's... So, Dirk, do you want to get us started? Are there any tech solutions that are out there in terms of the energy transition that you're really excited about?
Well, there's cool stuff and there's the real pragmatic stuff, right? Yeah. The cool stuff is like the modular nuclear reactors and things that really inspire many of us. But there's also the very pragmatic things that maybe get overlooked a little bit. You talked about demand side challenges, and I think our company also are helping. Another different company that is helping on demand side response as an aggregator, and I think the mobilizing this in an intelligent way and adding IT technology and artificial intelligence to it, I think goes a long way. And also in the distribution grids with all the distributed energy resources. So that's fantastic, and I think often maybe it's overlooked because it seems not so sexy, not so really groundbreaking, but it has a huge impact, and I think you can testify that this is really a topic. And then the other things, another aspect I would like to highlight is also, we talk a lot about infrastructure enhancement, but there are also, if you look at clients who need to do fuel switching as one of the measures, developments like the hydrogen biofuel is it's relatively recent, right? Less than 10 years, and it still has. It already shows the big potential that is there with existing infrastructure, no change to the fleet, and significant reduction. So these are small things that we should not overlook, and also many of our clients are actually thinking about the topic of rather insetting. I mean, I think we had a lot of debate about offset certificates. I don't want to go there. I think it's a bit gone, that discussion. Personally, I think we should rather enable and guide and connect clients to learn from each other what actually in setting is possible, what is possible on that front, because it has a big link to Scope 3. And when you are in the Scope 3 discussion and you talk about carbon footprint of products and what benefit you can then share with your suppliers, I think you have a similar effect to developing nations without all of the more political aspects. So it's much more pragmatic. That's a bit the view that I'm representing here.
John?
Yes, so regarding the energy demand, the relatively equal split, a third, across buildings, manufacturing, and also transportation. So addressing them sort of in sequence. So buildings, obviously, we've started to look at through net zero buildings. I think heat pump, as controversial as it could be, is an innovation that is moving away from fossil fuels, so replacing what we've got in terms of fossil fuel driven technology to electrification. So the heat pump is obviously in the building scenario is a great innovation there. And I think that also lays its hands to heavy industry as well in certain instances. Heavy industrial heat pumps do play a part to play in the industry itself or in manufacturing. And I think obviously through transportation, there's the onset of EVs and also the smart grids associated with that. Dirk mentioned AI, but the increasing ability to manage the grids at a smaller scale, at a smarter scale, to be able to then utilize EV battery storage essentially, and then into the grid during sort of peak demands and offsetting the generation of renewables as well. I think that taking a step back to the industry side, I think the fuel replacement side of things is very important. I think we've worked with some clients that have invested in CHP in the past 10 years or so. Obviously, they were expecting that technology to last a lot longer than 10 or 15 years. But now they have a decarbonisation plan, net zero by 2030. They really need to look hard at what they can do around CHP. And I think there will be, luckily for them, they have a dual burner, so they can replace the gas with hydrogen. But these are stopgaps towards an electrified future. I think that we do need to look at innovation. Innovation will support that area and hopefully drive the changes that are required.
Michelle?
Yeah, not much more to add. Clearly, technical solutions are going to be the focus going forward. I mean, a lot of the technologies will continue to evolve. I judge the Renewable Energy Association Awards, and it's really interesting because 10 years ago it was all made up of all developers and people who were providing the actual physical solution, and now over 50% of the people we're judging are tech solution providers. But I think that there's a huge amount more to be done. I mean, I'm working with some really exciting clients who are into creating smart grid systems and systems that on off-site distributed energy projects link all the different energy storage types, and it links the energy demand with the energy supply. So, for example, they're looking at using the car batteries on that particular site, and the batteries, for example, of a fleet as part of that entire power solution, as well as the solar panels or what have you, and the actual batteries themselves. So there's an awful lot going on. If I'm honest with you, it goes way above my head, but that's really what's going to drive how we engage with the energy sector going forward.
Emma?
Yeah, and I think I'd like to sort of complement some of the comments that John made, where he talks about this electrified future. And I think when I look at the story of hydrogen, hydrogen is gone through many phases where it's promised many things, and it's been difficult to do many things. And I think where it is now, the state of the sector is, it's having to show value within a decarbonising world. You know, you have to make the hydrogen, which I think probably most of you will be aware of, but there's various pathways, and all of them have some value in this transition away from carbon towards a zero carbon fuel, which ultimately is what hydrogen is. There's very interesting innovations in linking hydrogen production to modular high temperature nuclear reactors, which I think is something that is becoming a more sort of interesting part of the dialogue. There's obviously producing hydrogen from electrolyzers linked to renewables, and I think the cost of doing that is still high, but is coming down as that technology matures. And as I say, it has space, particularly if you have stranded power or intermittent power and the need to provide buffering, or you have an on-site power requirement that's perhaps off-grid. There's a good space for that. I think as we move in the transition, what we need to be, I guess, educating the sector around the wider clean energy sector is the transition of hydrogen is produced today from natural gas. It's produced today mainly in a way that releases CO2, but over time the sector recognises that we need to use CCUS, we need to use perhaps other derivatives, we need to consider at a certain stage in time perhaps importing some hydrogen from other areas and working globally just to bring the molecules into our sector to demonstrate how some of these end-use applications in hard to electrify sectors can show their face. So this can be in industrial decarbonisation. And as I also mentioned, as a fuel, I think we see the passenger car being very much driven by EVs. But if you look at off-road vehicles, if you look at HGVs, ultimately if you look at aviation and maritime, they need a solution which is not just based on batteries. And this is where using hydrogen as a zero carbon fuel is really having to show where its potential can lie. So there's lots of interesting, I would say, solutions at different stages of both economic and technical development. But there's a lot to be excited about, but we need to work collaboratively with the electrification direction, and everyone can find their space. I think that's what I would say. Yeah.
Rhian?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the stuff that Dirk said was not so sexy and some things you can do on our networks. So we have this National Grid Partners $500 million investment, and it deliberately goes and invests in organisations with interesting technology that we can use on our network. So 3 examples. One is TS Conductor, which has high-performing conductors for our power lines, which reduces the power that increases the power we can put through our lines. But from a sustainability perspective, also reduces our Scope 3 emissions. So to your point about commercial value and then also sustainability, it ticks both boxes. There's another one called Line Vision, which is really innovative AI data where we put boxes on our towers and it measures the sag through different weather settings in our lines, and then gives us a more real-time understanding of what power we can put through the lines, i.e. more, so they become more efficiently used. And then the final one that I'm partial to, bearing in mind I spend a lot of my time in sustainability, is AI Dash, which is satellite imagery and then sort of bottom-up analysis. And it allows us to understand, you know, if you can imagine our lines, they're literally built across the country and straight lines, and we have vegetation either side of our lines. What we need is that vegetation not to fall on the lines, because if it falls on the lines go out, lights go out, we have an outage. What we use this AI Dash for is to understand the pace of growth along our lines. What it helps then is make sure that trees don't overgrow our lines, so if there's a storm come in, trees fall on the lines. It means we spend less money cutting the vegetation along the line. So it basically ticks a box on security of supplies. It keeps the lines working. It ticks a box on cost efficiency because we spend less time cutting the vegetation down the lines. But also what it's enabled us to do is use more natural species and more slow-growing species along the lines. So there's a sort of nature biodiversity angle. So to your point, how do you make sure that you're telling a story that is about clean, the transition, net zero, but also is about commercial value security of supply. I think those examples do all of those. So the not sexy stuff, I'm afraid, I get quite excited about.
Incredible. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I thought we would have a little ask straight at the front and ask the audience if they had any questions. If we can get a microphone right down to the front here, please. And then a reminder as well to our online audience, there is an option for you guys to ask questions as well, and they'll come straight through to me on the iPad, so please do feel free to. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Pauline from Vodafone. You mentioned that one of the challenges is the regulatory and political uncertainty around energy and especially renewable energy. So I was wondering from a corporate perspective, how do we de-risk the investment in renewable energy? So I'm thinking, for example, if we sign a PPA agreement that's 10 years long, how do we de-risk that investment and make sure it's fit for the future? Thank you.
Sorry, from a regulatory perspective or in general, de-risk in general?
I think both, but particularly interested in how do we manage our investments that we're doing now. For example, when we sign PPAs,
Right.
Knowing that there might be loads of regulatory and technical changes in the next 10 years.
Yeah, look, fair question, and I think we're battling with that question every day, right? So I think, in the end, I think there are two sides of the answer. One side is within the company, there has to be an alignment between the financial function and the operational and, let's say, sustainability function. Because what we often see is operations, sustainability function, hey, we need to decarbonize, we need to do this for certain reasons, investment security, etc. Financial says, no, sorry, too much risk, can't do it. And that debate is a healthy debate. And so to moderate that debate, to basically demonstrate that in the end, maybe the volatility that the financial community in that function sees is overall not that big compared to other volatilities they're dealing with. This is something we observe. It's an education piece. It takes a lot of time. It's very frustrating in many cases, but it's worthwhile because we see companies who've cracked the nut, and once you crack the nut, then you have actually evolved as an organization to the next level, and you can actually process more and more renewable instruments, even beyond PPAs. The other side is regulatory, and I think because we see very clearly in the last month, you cannot really foresee regulatory changes. The only way to do it is to account for it, as every business does, in a certain risk, in a risk assessment, and you need to reflect your personal in the sense of every business has their own risk assessment. You need to just reflect that in the business case. That's very practical perspective, probably.
And just to touch on what I was talking about before, the transformation, the transition planning covers a lot of those elements. You've got the governance model that sees the sort of the squeezing at one end that then impacts the other, the alignment of strategy and making sure that everyone is focused on one agenda. But also the other side of it is the scenario analysis. So there is a requirement to undertake a climate scenario analysis, which will look at transitional risk. We've been supporting clients through that process at the moment, and it really looks at the regulatory changes. I appreciate you can't foresee some that are immediate and actionable due to geopolitical elements, but it does give you that level of preparedness moving forwards. May not specifically relate to PPAs, but there is a solution there.
I was going to build on that point. It might not exactly, it doesn't answer your question about PPAs, but it is an illustration. So we published our second climate transition plan in May last year, setting out, our pathway to 2050 and then how we get through our near-term targets in 2030. But to your point, there's a lot of risk in our plan. A lot of it we don't control. We either need technology solutions to come forward at scale and be commercial, or we have dependencies around the policies that are put in place or the regulation and the regulatory settlements that we need and the investment we need to make this happen. And so we just spelt that out really clearly. So that's not to say, and we sort of said, look, we work in an ecosystem, we're not on our own, and we need the whole ecosystem to be pulling in the same direction. So I don't think, it maybe doesn't exactly answer the question, but it does show the interdependencies that we probably all have and the way we all rely on each other actually to pull in the same direction.
Yeah. And I think, again, if I look at the experience of how some of the major hydrogen projects are evolving, I think to build on your point, and then your one about internal communication, I think then that taking that externally and working collaboratively between players is absolutely essential. I'm sure it's across the piece, but it certainly is when you're trying to deliver a major project that's producing the hydrogen molecules, that's storing them, that's then trying to engage with maybe a series of industrial end users to take them and commit to that over the long term. So I think there's some very interesting work now done in certain regional sectors of the UK that are trialling this as an initiative. Engagement with industrial users and giving them confidence that this technology is going to fit within their decarbonisation strategy and will work effectively for them in the long term is important. So building and keeping that confidence and working collaboratively where everyone has a piece and I guess an element of risk is essential, I would say. So
It's a commercial negotiation, regulatory risk, price risk. We've advised on thousands of PPAs. I can chat with you afterwards.
Thank you for your question. We are running out of time, but I think we can take one more if there is. The hand, was there some? I think, yeah, stripe it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Zora. I'm a senior researcher at University of Nottingham. It was amazing discussion. Thank you for everything. I have a question. You mentioned I think it was about 42% increase in demand in electricity. Could you please just clarify, this is compared to exactly what time? And is there any data that we can just conclude that how much of this increase can be attributed to installation of heat pumps and the shift toward electrification for space heating?
So to clarify, it was 42% increase in demand requests on our distribution network in 23-24, so in the year alone. So it's not people wanting to connect because they're building new generation, so solar farms, wind farms, etc. It's people who want it for use, so it will relate to electric vehicles and heat pumps. I don't have the detailed numbers underneath that. I guess it shows that on our networks, it's not just that people, as was typically the case, most of our connections used to be about generation connections, is that there's just a significant increase in demand, and it will be driven by electric vehicles and heat pumps predominantly. And the data centers, I should say, sorry, go back to particularly on our transmission, but also on our distribution network.
It's incredible. I feel like we could talk about the energy transition all day. There are so many complexities and so many things to talk about. But we are going to have to wrap up. I was going to ask one little favour before we go. Could I ask you all one piece of advice for business leaders looking to support the energy transition? What piece of advice would you give? I'm sure that many people in this room would appreciate. Do you want to start us off? Thank you.
I think, I mean, we spoke a bit about the global landscape and some of the immediate challenges. And what I see and reflect is that some of the accepted norms are shifting in terms of language that we see in from certain political administrations, and it kind of, I think people are unsaying things that we thought were said and were, let's say, agreed. So I think as a sector, I think we need to be proud of what we can contribute to a cleaner future. I think we need to maintain confidence around the terms of sustainability and net zero and defend them and be, real ambassadors for them, because we're in a world where I think language is removing certain phrases from the discourse, and that in itself might over time change people's minds and create a mind shift. So I feel defending our space is important. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I'm going to sort of build on that, but I think the transition to net zero in 2050 is a long-term game, and so we need to keep our eyes on the long term and keep our eyes on the prize, and to some extent hold our nerve. But if I put my CSO hat on, I also think sustainability isn't an add-on to strategy. It should be embedded in strategy, and so make sure that it's not this thing on the side, that it's absolutely a core part of the DNA of the strategy of the organisation.
The advice is to see energy transition as a form of resilience and competitiveness, or competitive strengthening, and also don't make it over sophisticated. If you basically see that your supply chain is directionally following your own journey with more or less the same speed, great. You don't need to overcomplicate it, and there's a lot of pragmatic solutions out there.
My advice would be that although the acceleration for the transition is increasingly important, I think that we need to realize what we can achieve now and plan for that and strategize it. So moving back on what I was saying before, looking at the governance, looking at the transition and transformation planning is going to be really critical for the preparedness for the future. The innovations aren't necessarily at our fingertips just now, but they will be in the future. So preparing at this point is really critical.
So my advice to business leaders would be that the one thing we can be certain about is uncertainty. And what's absolutely critical is that you can show all of your key stakeholders that net zero is delivering value, financial value. That means you need to have a very clear strategy, and you need to have a very clear engagement and narrative with your stakeholders. And you need to be updating them as things change, because if you have a strategy today, it will change. It'll probably change in 6 months' time. The key is to keep your key stakeholders updated, whether they are your customers, whether they're your institutional investors, whether they're your bankers, whether they're your insurers, or your employees. You keep them updated, and you show them how you are readjusting your strategy, but still with the end goal, as you were saying, the end goal in sight. But clarity and transparency and engagement now is absolutely critical, I would say.
And on that note, it's time for another networking break. But before we go, if we could extend a hand to the incredible panelists, please.